I'm Lori. Sitting in my new, cozy downtown apartment, surrounded by the minimalist decor that I chose without any compromise, I often find my mind drifting back to that fateful night when my world shattered. It was a Wednesday, just like any other day, but little did I know it would be the last day of my seemingly stable marriage. My husband, Ryan, and I had been married for 6 years. I grew up in a close-knit family where my parents, both school teachers, instilled in me the values of hard work and honesty. Ryan, on the other hand, came from a wealthy family. His father was a successful businessman, and his mother was a socialite. They were used to getting what they wanted and often had a sense of entitlement. That Wednesday evening, I came home at 6:30 p.m. Just as I always did. The house was dark and silent. There was no music from the kitchen speaker as there usually was when Ryan got home before me. His car wasn't in the driveway, but I didn't think much of it. He'd been saying he was working late a lot recently. I went about my routine, reheating leftovers, answering a few emails, and folding laundry in front of the TV without really paying attention. By 9 p.m. I texted him, asking what time he'd be home. No response. By 11 o'clock, I was annoyed. By midnight, I was worried. I called him 4 times, but each time it went straight to voicemail. At 1:47 a.m. My phone buzzed with a text message. You'll hear from my lawyer only. Consider us done. I stared at the screen for 5 full minutes, reading the words over and over, waiting for them to make sense. There was no explanation, no warning, no conversation. Just a simple, brutal end to our marriage. I called him immediately, but it was voicemail again. I texted back, asking what the hell was going on. A few minutes later, he replied that he'd been unhappy for a long time and couldn't do this anymore. His lawyer would contact me about the division of assets. 6 years of marriage ended by 2 text messages just before 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch we'd picked out together 3 years ago in the living room we'd painted ourselves, trying to figure out how I'd missed the signs. Looking back, there had been clues. Ryan had been distant lately, short-tempered, and overly protective of his phone. He'd changed his passcode 3 weeks earlier without telling me. When I asked, he said I was overthinking things. By morning, the shock had worn off and a cold, clear determination set in. If he wanted the marriage to end, so be it, but not on his terms alone. As soon as the bank opened at 8:01 a.m. I called. I froze our joint checking account, our joint savings, and removed him as an authorized user on my credit cards. I'd been the primary earner throughout our marriage, working in finance and making nearly triple his income. Most of the accounts were in my name with him added as an afterthought. The bank representative hesitated, asking if there was an emergency. I simply said, my marriage just ended. I need to protect my assets. She processed everything without another word. Then I called HR at work and had Ryan removed from my health insurance, life insurance, and all beneficiary designations. The woman on the line was kind and efficient, asking if I needed any resources. I declined, saying I just needed the changes made. I took the day off work and called the best divorce attorney I knew by reputation. Her retainer was steep, but I paid it without hesitation. At 2 p.m. I sat across from her in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and told her the whole story. She raised an eyebrow when she saw the text messages. No warning? She asked. I shook my head. None. She then asked about the frozen accounts, and when I said I'd frozen all of them, she gave a small smile. Good. That was smart, she said. That evening, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. When I answered, Ryan's voice, shaking with fury, came through. What the hell did you do? He demanded. I calmly replied that I was securing our assets pending legal proceedings, just as his text had implied. He was enraged, saying his card had been declined at the grocery store and that his rent was due. When I asked about the rent, there was a long, heavy silence. I quietly asked if he already had an apartment. He tried to deny it, but I knew it was exactly what my lawyer had warned me about. He started yelling about humiliation, insurance, and how cruel I was being. I listened until he ran out of breath and then told him that he'd ended the marriage, and I was just responding. He hung up on me. The next few days were a strange imitation of normal life. I went to work, answered emails, and sat through meetings as if my world hadn't fallen apart at 1:47 a.m. On that Wednesday. At night, I came home to a house that still smelled like him. His shoes were by the door, his jacket hung on the hook in the hallway, and his chipped coffee mug sat in the sink as if he might come back for it. I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it and slept in the guest room. By Friday morning, I noticed some small absences. His laptop was gone from the home office, as was the watch his father had given him. There was also a duffel bag I didn't recognize. We'd installed security cameras last year after a neighbor's break-in, and it was then that I remembered them. I pulled up the footage and saw that on Thursday at 2:14 p.m. Ryan had let himself in. He moved around the house quietly, like a thief, opening drawers and scanning shelves, taking what he wanted and leaving the rest. At one point, he stood in the living room for 30 seconds, just looking around before leaving. That night, my phone rang again. It was another unknown number. I almost didn't answer. A young woman's voice, nervous and barely controlled, came through. "Hi, this is really awkward. My name is Emily. I need to talk to you about your husband." I felt the air leave my lungs. I sat down at the kitchen table without realizing I'd stood up. She went on to say that she hadn't known Ryan was married at first. He'd told her he was divorced, showed her fake paperwork, and said we were separated and just finishing up selling the house. In reality, we'd been sleeping in the same bed until Wednesday night. He'd moved into her apartment on Wednesday, showing up around midnight with suitcases, saying he'd finally ended things with me and they could be together for real. Emily then explained that Ryan had lost it the day before. He'd started screaming about the frozen accounts and insurance, and how I'd ruined him financially. He'd tried to use her credit card, and when she said no, he'd thrown her laptop across the room, broken a lamp and a picture frame, and started yelling that she was supposed to take care of him. Before he stormed out, she'd looked through some papers he'd left on the counter. There were bank statements showing transfers from our joint accounts to another account in just his name, thousands of dollars at a time over the past 5 months. Nearly $40,000 had been siphoned out. I asked her to send me photos right away, and she said she already was. She also told me that before he'd freaked out, he'd been on the phone with someone, probably his brother or a friend, talking about taking the house and making me pay, and how he could make people believe he was scared of me. I laughed sharply. I'd given him complete freedom, never tracking him or questioning where he went. Clearly, that had been my mistake. I asked Emily if she'd give a statement if my lawyer asked. She hesitated at first, worried about legal trouble. I assured her that she wasn't liable for his lies and that her testimony could be crucial. She agreed. I forwarded all the evidence to my lawyer, writing evidence of financial misconduct. A fair partner willing to testify. Call me ASAP. She called back in 10 minutes, saying it was very good for our case. For the first time since the text message, I realized that Ryan hadn't panicked, he'd planned this all along. My lawyer moved quickly. By noon, she'd filed an emergency motion to prevent Ryan from accessing any remaining marital funds and to compel disclosure of every account in his name. She said it wasn't just infidelity, it was financial misconduct, possibly fraud. At 3:17 p.m. Ryan texted me, saying we needed to talk in person. I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, he texted again, saying things were getting out of hand. That made me laugh. At 4:02 p.m. The front door opened. I hadn't invited him. He looked wrecked. The same clothes from Wednesday night, unwashed hair, and dark shadows under his eyes. The confidence he'd always carried was gone. He said we needed to talk, but I told him his lawyer should contact mine. He snapped at me to forget the lawyers and said he'd made a mistake. I tilted my head and told him he'd made dozens of mistakes over months. When I said Emily had called me and told me everything, the color drained from his face. He sank onto the couch, muttering that it was a mess. I told him he'd made it a mess. He tried to blame it on our relationship, saying he'd met Emily at a conference last spring and that she'd paid attention to him while I was always busy with work. I cut him off, telling him not to try to make it about my career. I reminded him that he'd cheated, stolen nearly $40,000, rented an apartment with marital funds, and lied to everyone. He claimed he was going to give the money back, but I knew he was just trying to save face. I showed him the bank statements and told him I also had the texts where he'd talked about taking the house and painting me as controlling. He said Emily had kicked him out and that he had nowhere to go. I felt nothing but distance. I told him it wasn't my problem. He then begged me to fix things, saying we could go to counseling and he'd quit his job if he had to. I told him he didn't get to decide that now. He got angry and said I was enjoying watching him fall apart. I replied that I was just surviving something he'd done to me. He threatened to tell people I was controlling, but I smiled and told him I had 6 years of texts, emails, photos, friends who would testify, Emily's statement, the bank records, and the lease for his secret apartment. I dared him to try. He then asked for some of his things. I told him he had an hour and to leave the key on the counter. 40 minutes later, he came down with 2 suitcases. He stopped at the door and said he was sorry and that he'd really loved me. I told him to own his choices and then locked the door behind him. The legal process was a long, methodical one. There were no dramatic court scenes like in the movies, just endless paperwork. My lawyer filed first, responding to Ryan's claim that he'd left due to emotional neglect. She used text messages, vacation plans, and emails to show the stability and affection in our relationship right up until he left. Ryan's lawyer tried to argue that my higher income created an imbalance of power, but my lawyer simply slid the bank statements across the table, showing the systematic transfers over 5 months. The room went quiet. 2 weeks later, Emily provided a sworn statement. 3 months into the process, at the mandatory mediation session, I saw Ryan again. He looked thinner, older, and smaller, without his wedding ring. His lawyer did most of the talking, and when the mediator asked if either of us wanted to speak, Ryan opened his mouth and then closed it. I said nothing. 4 months after the text message that ended everything, the divorce was finalized. Ryan received 15% of the marital assets, which almost canceled out what he'd already taken. I kept the house, my retirement accounts, and my car. After the divorce, I stayed in the house for a year. I learned that healing isn't about erasing memories but about reclaiming space. Eventually, the memories stopped hurting, and I sold the house. I bought a smaller, modern place closer to downtown, a space that was truly mine. I dated a little, and about 8 months after the divorce, I met someone kind, steady, and honest. On our 4th date, I told him everything. He just listened without judgment. We dated for 6 months, but we wanted different futures, so we parted as friends. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like a relationship ending meant I'd failed. I spent time alone, traveled, reconnected with old friends, took a cooking class, started running, and finished a half marathon. I learned that people show their true colors when their comfort is threatened, and protecting myself wasn't vindictive, it was survival. Emily reached out about a month after everything settled. She sent an email saying Ryan had disappeared from her life after destroying her apartment, leaving her with damaged bills and broken trust. She said she felt used. I told her I didn't blame her but didn't want further contact, and she understood. Now, as I sit in my new apartment, I don't hate Ryan. He's just someone I used to know, someone whose choices revealed exactly who he was. I sleep well at night, knowing I handled everything with integrity, and I have a life that's entirely my own.